Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. On today's video, we're going to be revisiting the old Atari 520 ST. There's been several parts to this video, so if you haven't been following along, I recommend you look below in the description. I'll have links to all the previous videos, because it's a good idea to catch up before you watch this one. In fact, it's been a little bit of time since I made the last video on this machine, and I myself had to go back and review my own video to see what was up next for the repairs on this. So with the ST in today's video, we're going to be installing a new RAM expansion card, probably the most reliable RAM expansion possible for the 520. We'll be checking out this cartridge that came with this machine. It's called the Descart from QMI. I'll also be finishing up that disk drive, which is sort of disassembled after trying to get it working on the last video. And also, if there's time, be testing out some software on this thing. So without further ado, let's get right to it. All right, the pretty much left for dead Atari 520 ST. I retro-brighted this case in a previous video when the weather was more amenable to that outside, and it really did come out great. There's absolutely no flaws whatsoever with the case. It's a little bit dusty because it's been a few months. The keyboard, on the other hand, of course, I did not attempt to retro-bright, and that's gonna have to wait until, well, maybe I can break out the old blue box. I'll put a link in the description to that if you haven't seen my videos on that, but it's a box with some LEDs that seems to do a pretty good job retro-brighting. But ultimately, I prefer to do it outside in the sun, and here in Oregon where I live, well, it's wintertime. That means there's really not much sun to be had, and there's definitely no warmth, which helps with the retro-bright process. So for now, I will just be living with this two-tone look to the old 520 ST, which, while it looks weird, I actually don't mind it so much. Now, as a bit of an upgrade, I actually have the ST connected to the open source scan converter using a couple cables that I made plug into the back of the machine so I can actually do video captures from the ST, which is awesome. I even went so far as to add an RCA audio output from the cable because this particular ST doesn't have RCA jacks on the back. As you can see, the machine is still booted up and it's working perfectly after the repair I did in a previous part. As a quick refresher, the MMU chip in this machine actually went bad. In addition, it had a RAM expansion, which is in here, we'll look at that in a second, which required a couple traces to be cut on the board. So in addition to that new MMU that works again, I had to undo the mods that were required to make this RAM expansion work. So the computer is still working great, so thumbs up to that. So I never put the case screws back in this, so we can just lift the hood to get access to this machine. And there it is, the motherboard of the early versions of the Atari ST. It only has the capability of having 512K on the motherboard. Later machines or later versions of the 520 ST actually had 2 rows of chips, and sometimes they were in different positions on the motherboard, where you could actually upgrade the board by removing the solder and installing a second set of chips, which would at least turn your 512K machine into a 1024K machine. This is the memory management unit that I replaced on this ST, which made it work. And if we take a look at the schematics for this machine, here is that MMU chip. Now, one thing that's kind of cool is even though Atari only sold this machine originally with 512K, they actually designed the memory management chip with 4 megabytes capability in mind. And if we look at all the signals that come out of this chip, there are 2 things that are responsible for allowing it to support up to 4 megs of RAM. Now, first off, there's only 512K on this schematic, just like what matches on this motherboard. Right here, you have the address lines that go to the RAM chips, and you can see 0 through 8 are actually connected. But notice there is an address line 9, pin 64 on the MMU, that's not connected at all. And then if you look down here, you see these RAS and CAS lines. Well, RAS 0 and CAS 0 high and low are for addressing the first bank of memory, which is really the first 16 chips on the motherboard, as seen on this particular 520. There's actually a RAS1 and a CAS1 high and low, which isn't connected as well, and that is to support the second bank of memory. Now keep in mind, this is a 16-bit machine, which means you need 16 chips to equal 1 bank of memory. And 8 of those chips each is connected to CAS high and the other 8 to CAS low. So the way it would work on an ST that supported a 1 meg right on the motherboard is it would have a second set of RAM chips connected to RAS1 and these two CAS lines. That's the second bank of 512K, totaling 1 meg. If Atari had only supported the second bank with these RAS and CAS lines, then the most memory that would be possible to support on any ST that uses this MMU would be 1 megabyte. But the fact is, this extra address line is sitting here, and when you hook up this extra address line to appropriate RAM chips, you actually quadruple the capacity of that bank of RAM, which would turn this 512K into 2 megabytes. But of course, you need larger capacity RAM chips, which have a different pinout, so you can't just install those on the motherboard. I'm pretty sure that some smart hardware hacker back in the day figured out how to piggyback a second set of 512K of RAM on top of these, and you would just need to run the extra RAS and CAS lines, lifting them from your soldering job and running those bodge wires over to the MMU, probably some points on the motherboard, and then you just have to connect all those lines together. That would enable this thing to have 1 meg of RAM right on the motherboard. So that brings us to this, ST-RAM upgrade fragile. So this is the Marpet RAM upgrade that was in this machine when I got it. So I wrote fragile because this thing is super fragile, and it's actually funny about the way that these RAM upgrades all seem to work on the ST. So obviously right here we have 4 megs of memory, and due to these fragile SIM sockets, there's like a lot of hot glue or whatever to hold that together. But this RAM board is literally only holding this RAM. It doesn't really do much. You have to interface this memory with what's on the motherboard. Obviously, when you have 4 memory modules installed in here, that's taking up both banks of memory that the MMU supports. So the onboard memory does need to be disabled, and that was done by cutting those traces, which I have since reversed, and I did that on the back of the motherboard. But to use this memory expansion, you have to connect the RAM to a couple different things. You have to connect it to the data bus, so that's all 16 data bus lines on the Atari ST. You have to connect it to the address bus, and that again are these address bus lines seen on the MMU here. And then you also, of course, need to hook this up to the RAS and the CAS lines, and that's both sets of them because there are 2 banks of memory here. So that is these lines right here on the MMU. Well, you notice that this RAM expansion has these 2 boards on the end of these ribbon cables. The first one here has a 40-pin DIP socket on it and the equivalent pins on the bottom. That plugs under this chip here, which is called the shifter chip. This is the graphics chip, so to speak, on the ST. It interfaces directly to the RAM, so it has access to all 16 data bus lines. So you simply lift this chip out of the socket and install this into there, and that gives this RAM board here access to all the data bus lines it needs. But this chip does not have access to the address bus lines that the MMU generates for the memory. And to get to that, this board was created. I think I talked about how this works in the video where I removed this thing, but I understand it a lot better now than I used to. So if you notice, this little PCB has these very thin pins here. And the idea is you push these pins and this little circuit board over the MMU. The idea are these pins are supposed to go between this plastic outer shell and these metal contacts that contact this PLCC chip. The problem though is that these PLCC sockets and the pins in here are very fragile, and any kind of damage that you cause to these pins will create a non-functional Atari ST. In addition, any contact problems between these pins and the MMU socket and the MMU chip are going to cause problems because basically this thing is talking directly to the RAM on those address lines and those RAS-CAS lines, and you need those signals to be very clear without any integrity issues, or you're of course going to have issues and crashes and other problems. To make matters even worse is Atari used non-standard PLCC sockets. Now, a viewer donated several sockets and chips for me to repair Ataris in the future, and in his little package of connectors are 2 of the PLCC sockets. Now, this is one that could replace this one if it were bad. Luckily, it's not. And the reason that these are non-standard is the pin spacing. Every other PLCC socket I've ever seen has pins that are arranged in rows around the edges. This thing has a staggered layout. You're probably not gonna be able to see it very easily, but the pins go back and forth in a zigzag motion around the sides. Completely different and incompatible with every other socket that you could still easily buy today for very little money. So I'm holding on to these 2 rare PLCC sockets here, along with some of these other weird DIN sockets used for, I think, the floppy drive and stuff like that. for the day I ever have to replace or repair an ST and change out this socket, especially if it's been damaged by a RAM expansion board like this one. Now, it's pretty much my understanding that all ST RAM expansions work this way. Well, not all, but almost all, because this is a way a user could actually do the install themselves. The 40-pin ribbon cable here is very easy, but I can imagine many a user tried to install one of these boards themselves by pushing this over the MMU and damage the socket, rendering their ST broken. But unfortunately, the alternative would be you'd have to solder wires for each of the address lines and all the RASCAST lines to various points on the motherboard, like around these resistors, and it would just be a bit of a mess. It'd be totally doable, but you'd have to know exactly what you were doing with the exact revision of ST motherboard, because as I mentioned, Atari moved things around a lot, like sometimes the RAM's over here, or sometimes there's two banks. There are many permutations of these motherboards, therefore, those connection points move around. This ribbon cable thing just means you plug this in, you plug this in, I think you hook up this ground line, and it should work. Now, after I talked about the fact that I would probably try to reinstall this in the machine, I had many viewers reach out to me and say, do not do that. You're just asking for problems. Of course, I could damage this socket, and most likely it's going to result in an unreliable Atari ST, especially over time. If it gets jostled or bumped, it'll just stop working. So this is where one of my viewers, Steve from the UK, comes in. He went ahead and sent me this, which is an open source RAM expansion for the Atari ST. We'll bring it up to 4 megabytes of RAM, and it's soldered into the machine in a way that A, won't risk any damage to the MMU, and B, also will never come out. Besides the fact that this board is not going to come loose and cause crashes, the negative about it is you have to remove all the RAM on the motherboard before you can install this into the same place on the board where the RAM is. So it's going to look like that one is done. But of course, I have the arduous task of removing these 16 RAM chips. And because this plugs into the existing holes on the motherboard, there are signals that aren't available. And if we go back to the schematics, we can imagine right here, it's going to be this 9th address line along with the RAS1 and CAS1 lines. Well, there are holes right here where I'm going to have to solder wires for 4 connections from there to a couple points on the motherboard to bring those signals into this board. There's a couple minor problems with this RAM board. If you download it from GitHub, it will outline those on the project. You have to swap, well, I guess I would swap the wires that go to CAS1, L, and H. So it's just mislabeled. Also, there's a missing trace that goes from that pin on that RAM chip over here to this pin on that RAM chip. So I'm just going to have to add a bodge wire after I am done with the installation. And the only other potential issue is after this is installed, it'll have a permanent 4 meg RAM upgrade. I'm thinking that I could probably disable half the memory by, I think, taking the RAS line off and bridging it to 5 volts, or basically pulling it high for these 2 RAM chips. And that should have the effect of completely disabling at least 2 megabytes of the memory. I've heard there are some pieces of software that don't like having 4 megs of RAM and won't run, but I think pretty much everything will work fine with 2 megs of RAM, although I'm not totally sure about that. So I think it's time to take this motherboard out of here and start taking these chips out. I'm going to do a time lapse for the removal of the chips. Desoldering this many ICs and pins is not for the faint of heart. A total of 256 pins across all of these chips. Make sure you have a really good desoldering iron and your technique is rock solid, otherwise you do risk causing damage to your board. I have to admit the Hakko 301 I'm using gets a little heavy in your hand when you're holding it for this long. I'd probably benefit from having a desoldering iron where the main suction is external to what you're holding, so it's not quite so bulky and heavy. What I'm doing at this point is after I desoldered one set of pins, I go back with the desoldering iron and I just sort of push the pin away from the via, because a lot of times the pin will stick with a little tiny bit of solder that's left, and when you just push it away with some heat, you'll feel it tick and kind of release itself. That just helps remove the chip later. Now I'm working on the little RAM expansion board. Steve had actually soldered in some pins for me to keep them from falling out, I guess, during shipping. But the problem is they were all crooked and I can't get them into the board like that, so I had to remove all of them. All right, I am ready to go for installing this board finally. That was quite an arduous task, Getting the RAM out of the motherboard actually wasn't too difficult, but I really don't recommend you try this unless you have a really good desoldering equipment. If you try to do this with soldering braid, you will be in for a world of hurt. If you don't have something like a Hakko desoldering iron or something else, what I recommend you do is, if you're really gonna do this with no turning back, basically take some snips like these and cut along the top of the chip to remove the package. That will leave just these pins behind in the motherboard. And then what you can do is you can take your soldering iron and a pair of tweezers and then pull each one out carefully. But you're still gonna have to clean up all the holes on the motherboard. But once the package is out, the soldering braid, desoldering braid that is, should work okay. Next up is the RAM expansion board. I had to remove all of these pin headers that Steve had soldered on. He had only put them on with one pin on every single one of them, but the problem is they are all a little bit crooked. And ideally, the way I see this working is it's best to put all the pins into the motherboard and then, without soldering anything down, put the RAM board on top of them. That way you can angle and adjust them all so it fits perfectly. And then basically go ahead and solder all the rest of the connections. Unfortunately, these are the thick pin or the square pin type of headers, and they just fit in very tightly into this PCB. So desoldering them was actually pretty difficult. I might have spent not quite as much time as I did on the RAM, but yeah, a good amount of time on that. This is what I'm going to be using to attach this to the motherboard. These types of pins are much smaller and more forgiving with the positioning, and that should allow getting this into place a lot easier. So let's proceed with the time-lapse installation. I made a last-minute decision to install sockets first in the motherboard. So that's what I'm doing here. And the plan is to put the sockets in, but not solder them in, and then push all of the necessary pins into the sockets, which should hold them up and align them, and then put the RAM expansion PCB over those sockets. And with everything not soldered in, I should be able to jiggle it around and get those pins aligned properly into all the holes. Getting the pins to actually go into the PCB was a little bit of a trick, requiring quite a lot of fiddling and bending of the RAM board, as I started on the left side and tried to get the pins in, and then slowly made my way through all the way to the right side, using a little pick or a small screwdriver in this case to actually adjust the pins so they would go in. It was all very difficult and very fiddly. I had my water bottle at hand, so I stuck that on top of the board so that it would hold it in place while I started soldering just some of the pins on the top side to keep the board from moving and all the pins coming out. A little blue tack on both sides held the board to the motherboard so I could flip it over and at least solder some of the pins to the sockets on so that I could keep it from all falling apart and having to redo all the alignment again. It was important for me to make sure that the sockets were getting soldered down flat onto the motherboard, so I would solder one pin and then I would reach underneath and sort of bend and push the socket into the board with my other finger and then remelt that one pin so that the socket would be flat against the motherboard. At this point, everything is held in with at least one pin on each socket, so now it's time to go through and solder everything on completely so that all the pins will be fully connected again. It's now time to connect those extra signal wires from the RAM board to the motherboard. And I'm also referencing the original documentation Steve sent to connect that bodge wire between the RAM chip and that one pin to replace that missing trace. I'm using my cheap hot glue gun to just dab little bits of hot glue to hold that bodge wire down into place. And now just the final connections between those RAS-CAS lines and a point on the motherboard. All right, the installation is complete. The board's looking good installed on the Atari ST. Now I decided to go with sockets. I just couldn't bring myself to permanently installing this into the motherboard. And with sockets, I can always remove this if something's wrong or whatever and go back to regular DRAM chips. These are the ones I took out of the board. Installation of this board was definitely pretty fiddly. I have to say that a more universal and easy to install solution would probably be a combination of both this Marpet board, specifically something to go under the shifter chips here to access the 16 data bits, and then you would only need to really connect up to these two sockets to get all the address lines and the CAS-RAS lines. And to be honest, all you really need is one of the sockets actually to get all the address lines, because those are shared across every chip here. And then you would just have to run bodge wires to the RAS-CAS lines on that chip and also on the underside of the MMU to get these extra lines. Now I used really thin wire wrap bodge wire here, and I was able just to run it through the little holes that are in this ground plane right there. So that's what I decided to do. I know that another solution would just be to run it through that hole right there, but it's a little tighter there because there's a screw standoff that sticks through there when you install the motherboard, and this way it's just right there and it's nice and neat. Now, what I have done, if we flip this over, we can see this, is these bodge wires here actually aren't connected to the MMU yet. The RAS and CAS lines, I just connected those right to 5 volts. That's gonna keep those high and keep that bank of RAM completely disabled. And I also connected address line 9, which is what enables it to go from 512K per bank to 2 megs per bank. I connected that right to ground. So that's just basically gonna keep this machine right now, this should show up as 512K again. So I think at this point, it's time for testing, and let's get everything hooked up. Let me do a quick test without the keyboard or the disk drive, just have the power and the monitor connected. Here we go. All right, we got a white screen. Oh, look, it's working, everyone. It came up. All that manhandling of this motherboard and this this RAM board, I was like bending it to get it in. I was sort of afraid that it wouldn't work, but it's working. Okay, great sign. Let me grab the disk drive. All right, try number 2. Let's turn on the floppy drive. I do have it plugged into the in port this time, not like the mistake I made last time. Power on the Atari. I got no floppy drive on the desktop, and that is simply because I did not plug in the power supply for the disk drive. This bird's nest cables definitely is a detraction from using these earlier Ataris. I don't know if the disk drive is on, maybe, maybe not. Let's try again. All right, it's accessing, it's a good sign. I have a floppy disk here labeled Atari ST Utilities. Not quite sure what's on here, so we'll stick this in. All right, so it's booted up again and the mouse is not working. Is this because the keyboard's not connected? Maybe. Let me connect up the keyboard, just see if that is somehow related. I don't recall that to be the case. I know that without the keyboard connected, the machine beeps continually once it's booted up, but obviously I don't have a speaker hooked up. Oh, what just happened there? What is happening? It's like crashing now. Boy, we're having issues here. Unplug the keyboard. Let me fiddle around here, see if I can get this thing working. Okay, without the keyboard connected, it boots straight up into the TOS desktop there. Let's try it with the keyboard again. I'm holding it above the machine so it's not shorting or anything. Oh, and the mouse works. All right, so who knew that you need the keyboard to get the mouse working? I mean, I know on later STs, the keyboard and the mouse are the same. The mouse actually plugs in on the underside of the keyboard. But on this original one, the joystick ports are on the sysinfo of the machine. All right, I have sysinfo.prg here. Let's run this. And the machine is crashing. Okay, let's try the RAM tester. Nope, the RAM tester needs to be in the medium resolution as well. So let me change it. All right, well, anytime I try to go to set preferences, oh, there we go. The machine is definitely unhappy. It keeps crashing. Let's see if it actually stays in medium resolution. Nope. So all is not well with this machine. All right, I think it's time to check my work here. Maybe the way I've hooked up the RAS and CAS lines, or didn't hook them up, is making this whole thing somewhat unhappy. Just checking that the bodge wire that I installed is in the right spot, and it is. It goes from there to the 9th pin over from here, which definitely matches what's on here. Okay. Okay, so I've hooked up this board fully, and no more funny bypass, although I did install this switch here. You're probably wondering, what the heck is this all about? Well, I took the address line 9 and I ran it through this switch, and it goes back and right here onto the board where it's supposed to go. And then there's one side of the switch that also goes to ground. So with one position, you're actually hooking up address line 9 to the MMU, and the other position, you're going to be grounding it. That should have the effect of running this machine at 4 megabytes, or when you switch this, it should be 1 megabyte. And here's the bottom of the board. So all 4 lines are now hooked up. This is the address line 9 right there. And then these are the RAS, CAS, and well, the 2 CAS lines and then the RAS line. That blue wire there, and there's one over here, that was from last time repairing the cut traces on the top side of the board when they installed the Marpet RAM upgrade. I do have to add that this board plugged into the round hole sockets is really sturdy. Like I can lift the whole board from the RAM expansion. This is not going to come out accidentally from these sockets. So let's plug everything back in and see if this machine is working any better. Certainly a little concerned that it was acting so crashy and weird, especially because I think the way I had it hooked up before should have worked without issue. It's a little hard to get it all in frame here. The keyboard is connected, it's just off to the side here, as is the mouse, power, monitor, and the floppy drive. And here's the floppy drive. Okay, let's turn it on, see what happens. Okay, it booted up. Now you notice it's in medium resolution, and you can ignore that it's a little hard to read some of the pixels. That's just because I don't have the open source scan converter set up exactly right. I used my other ST to set the desktop up in medium resolution, and then I saved the desktop. So that means it boots up into this resolution. Okay, so let's see what sysinfo says if it runs at all. It's loading. Oh! Hey, look at that, it actually ran. All right, so look, it says 1 megabyte right here. If I scroll over there, there's 1 megabyte total. So that the up position on this switch here is actually 1. So I am just gonna draw a little 1 here and a 4. And I'm gonna use this little Sharpie here to draw a little arrow. There we go, just for my reference. All right, so let's power this off and switch this over to 4. Turn it back on. All right, well, it booted up. I'm still not really confident in the reliability of this machine. Not sure what was going on with that crashing, like I said. All right, there it is, 4 megabytes. Actually says 4 megs. That is cool. Right mouse button for menu. All right, let's exit out of here and try to run the RAM test. Yet another RAM tester. All right, test low memory first, just to make sure that the program itself can run. And then you just push a key on the keyboard and it starts the full RAM test. So I'm gonna leave this here and I'll capture the video and we'll let it run through a few cycles of this test. It's gonna take a lot longer, obviously, with 4 megs of RAM than when I ran this test last time. Okay. That just crashed right out of there. Okay, that's not reassuring, especially because why would it crash out when the program loaded? What the heck is going on? Okay, now wait, what? I can't click on anything. Okay, I was able to run the RAM tester again, but I was trying to run the sysinfo just so we could see what the memory said, and that wasn't running. Let's try running this again. What the heck is going on? All right, well now it's already gotten further with this RAM test than it did that first time when it exited out. But the fact that this crashed out like that is really not reassuring. I never had that problem on this machine before. I didn't really show this on video, but I actually did try some games on this computer and they absolutely worked perfectly. And I didn't just run them for like a minute. I actually played for 20, 30, 40 minutes. I don't really remember. I sat down and had a little gaming session without any issue with this machine. It was working flawlessly. So the RAM test is still actually working. So I'm just gonna let it run and I'm gonna step away and I'll come back and see if it's on pass number 2. I just came back downstairs and I see it's still on the first pass. It really does take a lot longer with this 4 megabytes in here. So, and it currently says 0 errors, but yet still working. So these kinds of weird randomy problems, like I didn't even touch this machine. I didn't bend the board. So if it's like a bad contact, I just simply reset it. And that's what we're doing right now. And it's working. These types of weird intermittent issues reek of one thing to me: power supply. And I haven't opened the power supply or looked inside. Maybe there's some capacitors that are leaking in there and it's not quite working perfectly well. I have had some experience before where I powered up an old computer that hadn't been used in a long time and everything was working perfectly. And then over time, as in it wasn't that much time from when I started using it, I started noticing that the machine was crashing and acting weird. And I opened up the PSU as a PC on the inside. And sure enough, several of the main filter caps had started leaking inside. And actually, what kind of clued me into that being the problem is I actually heard a little bit of like a hissing sound when the machine was running. And maybe possibly that's gone on with this ST power supply. It's sitting up here. That basically was working fine, but then me starting to use it kind of warmed it up and those caps started leaking and maybe they're having issues, possibly. Okay, so I notice here on the RAM test, we're on pass number 2. That means that all of this 4 megs of RAM is working, these chips are working. So it really has me confused about what is happening, because I think if these RAM chips were bad or something, let me just bump on this a little bit. I'm just gonna tap on the RAM card here while it's running the RAM test, see if it crashes out. No, it's not, it's fine. It's still running without issue. Move these cables around, maybe this power connector. All right, well, let me reboot out of this and let's see if we can boot back into TOS. Let's try running something. Let's try sysinfo. I mean, it works. I don't fully trust this thing. Let's turn this off, switch back to 1 meg, power this back on. Oh, I lost the video signal. That happens occasionally. That's the open source scan converter. Gets a little confused by the Atari signal. All right, sysinfo again. Okay, that worked. Let's see. I'm gonna turn it off. Let me just pick this motherboard up, bang it around a little bit, push down on things, see if that makes the difference here. Let's see what happens. Wow, loaded right into TOS, but it was doing that even from the very start. It just works. I mean, I think everyone saw, right? I'm not imagining that earlier on in the video, when I had this all hooked up for 4 megabyte operation, it definitely was crashing out, right? And then it just stopped. Let's switch over to Virtual Bench here, and I have the multimeter probes here. Let's hook these up and see what we got on the power rail here. There's a main cap. All right, we're getting 4.86 volts on Virtual Bench. That's not bad. I mean, that's not too low. It's low-ish, but it's certainly not on the low, on the too low side. Now this ST has a somewhat beefy 470 microfarad cap right here doing the bulk of the 5-volt filtering. There's also bypass caps around the board, like for each of these ICs here. It'll be between the 5-volt and the ground. This board as well has bypass caps for these 2 RAM chips, not to mention on the motherboard itself where it's getting power from these 2 spots right here, there's also bypass caps. So I'm definitely at a loss as to what's going on. Let me power cycle the computer again while we switch back to 4 megabyte mode. Just see what happens here when I turn it back on. Is this gonna be reliable? I mean, I just don't like these types of problems. Yeah, it's working. I just hate problems like this where things aren't working quite right and then seemingly they're fixed. That makes no sense to me, and that's very frustrating. So I think at this point, I'm just gonna reassemble this back into the case. I'm gonna put the disk drive back together so that's not hanging out like this, because this drive seems to work perfectly. There's no issues with that, I can tell. And then let's try running some software on here. And with the motherboard back in the case and the RF shield on, the computer still showing 4 megs of RAM. It booted right up, it didn't crash or anything. And I was about to screw the motherboard in, but I just had a horrible thought that what if the keyboard won't fit in the case? Because the keyboard rests right here over the motherboard. What if this RAM board is too tall now because I didn't put it directly onto the motherboard, I put sockets? That would completely suck. I guess all I can do is try it out. Oh boy, here we go. Yeah. It does not go into place. Oh no. I gotta say, I am not undoing all the work I did on this machine. If this cannot fit, could be that it's simply the switch. Looks like that toggle switch I installed there for the 4 or 2 megs is the problem. So I'm just gonna move that down here onto the board. It's just hot glued in place. Wow, the hot glue is strong. Let's just disconnect this. And let's just pull this up here. Got all this hot glue on here. It will come off with alcohol. I'm temporarily just gonna stick the thing down here, I guess, whatever. Out of the way. Nope. Oh man, oh man. It does not fit in this case. I could see the RAM chip is hitting the bottom of the keyboard when it tries to sit down in the case. So that, unfortunately, was a major fail on my part. I should have just installed it right into the motherboard. That was a lot of work. That was actually quite a lot of work, considering that was such a fail. I'm just thinking about what happened here. So I think I am really bummed out. That really, really bums me out. Wow. So I'm extracting this RAM board from the machine. I just removed those connections there to the extra RAS lines. And now this should just pull out. What a bummer. Look at that. So there are sockets under there, so I can install RAM again. And I guess it's possible to put this thing back in, but how? If I had used lower profile pins, perhaps, this probably would have worked as well. These are just really tall. Lower profile pins would have probably got this right in there. I was really curious when I put this thing together, if I did pull this out, would it even be possible to get the thing back in? Look at that. It goes right back in really easily. So that's interesting. That's kind of cool in a way, because I had it all connected together with all the pins in the sockets when I soldered the top and the bottom on. So what that means is that everything was in exactly the right place. So it comes off and goes back on really easily. But I can't use this. The only thing I'm thinking is maybe I can relocate this like over here. If I take this Marpet 16-bit adapter from the shifter, and then I solder the address lines directly onto the board, and if I put the board like something like this, then I would have to run the RAS-CAS lines there, and 10 address lines to there, and there's also some RAS-CAS lines that would come from the motherboard here. That would go to that. Oh, I don't know. Is it worth it? Is it actually worth it? There were a lot of comments from viewers who said that the 512K that actually was on this is the lowest common denominator for the ST, and that almost every piece of software, except for productivity software, completely works fine. If you're talking about games, that is. So I think right now, unfortunately, this video is a bit of a bust. I'm gonna not install that again. I'm just gonna put the original RAM back in this thing, and I'll put this computer back together, just like it was when I got it, 512K. A little sad music montage here. Just reinstalling the original chips I took out of this machine back into it. It's actually really easy to get them back in the sockets, so that's a nice change. And I'm just putting some heat shrink on those extra wires to the RAS-CAS lines, so when I put the computer back together, they don't short on anything. I dug into my screw collection of Commodore screws, and that's what I'm using to put this computer back together. They seem to work for the most part and didn't seem to stress out the standoffs too much. Well, I think I'm going to end the video here. I know I intended to get to the disk drive, the cartridge, and testing out the ST, but that is going to have to wait till a future video. This one was getting a little bit long. It's really cool to know that this RAM upgrade for the Atari ST that Steven said totally works. And that toggle switch I installed is also a convenient way to switch between 1 meg and 4 meg. So if you're installing one of these into your machine, you might as well make that mod. And of course, if you're daring enough, put a hole in the side of your ST and you can actually put the toggle switch on the outside. I'm not quite sure I was ready to do that on this ST because the case, after retrobriting, is in perfect shape. I am truly disappointed that I ended up not being able to use this in this machine due to the mistake of installing those sockets. Maybe at one point in the future I'll gain enough courage to remove those sockets and then I'll install this directly into the motherboard like it was designed to do. Just keep that in mind if you're doing it yourself. Do not use sockets. I think with this video, this is going to be the last video on this ST for a little while. So I really want to thank Richard, who was the original viewer from Seattle, who donated this machine to me, along with the people that donated to him, and he actually passed it on to me. I do have a substantial amount of 8-bit Atari stuff that I would like to get to. A lot of it's going to need repairs and stuff, so this won't be the end of the road for Atari stuff, but I just want to go back to the simpler things with 8 bits. I'd like to thank my patrons. Their names are scrolling up the side of the screen. Of course, if you want to become a patron, there's a link in the description and you can do so. But I also want to thank you, the viewer, for watching my videos. All the engagement and everything I get on the channel is what allows YouTube to show it to more people and helps my channel spread, and that means so much to me. The channel has grown quite a lot in 2021. The year's almost over. It's almost the end of the year, and I don't know what 2022 is gonna bring for me. I think there's potentially gonna be some changes in the future for me, but I'm not gonna talk about that at this point. So anyhow, yeah, if you like this video, I would definitely appreciate a thumbs up. But if you didn't, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to check out my second channel. You know, all the usual YouTube stuff. And I guess that's gonna be that. So stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.